Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
The 60s were some of the stormiest years in America's history. Millions of idealistic youth took to the streets, protesting against government policies and social norms that they perceived unjust. The youth revolution was mirrored by a dramatic change in music. The anti-war protest music of the 60s was a reaction to the Vietnam War, and it expressed opposition to U.S. policies in Vietnam, encouraging the revolution. In the short term, the anti-war protest music of the 60s undergirded the reforms that young people demanded in universities and politics. The anti-war movement toppled one president and caused another to wind down the war. Meanwhile, in the long run, we are still living with the liberationist ideals of the 60s and the conservative backlash against it. Moreover, we have inherited freedom of gender roles and of speech that could not have been imagined in the preceding decade.
All we are saying is give peace a chance.
Protest music in the United States goes back to the 1770s and is rooted in religious hymns written by slaves, with lyrics that talked about slavery. In the 1900s, protest music became the expression of workers wanting a union, and needy people wanting jobs during the Great Depression. In the 1940s and 50s, popular music was generally romantic and escapist, with songs such as The Fat Man.
They call me the Fat Man, but I wait till
The 1960s brought a dramatic change in the music preference of young people, and the revolutionary protest music of the 60s was born. To understand the musical revolution that reached its apex in the 60s, we need to go back to the 50s. As the Cold War was intensifying, the United States hardened its anti-Soviet policies. In 1955, President Eisenhower pledged his support to South Vietnam, in the hope that, together with the Diem government, we could overtake the communists of North Vietnam. The war escalated, and by 1967, U.S. troop presence peaked at 500,000. The casualty count reached 15,058, while soldiers came to mistrust the government's rationale for fighting and claims of winning.
And on it was a Viet Cong flag. Much is left in shambles. The Marines advance, building after building. The North Vietnamese retreat, building after building, giving up nothing without a fight.
At home, opponents of the war argued that civilians, not enemy combatants, were the primary victims in Vietnam. Mass protests were staged across the U.S., displaying the public's opposition to the war. The anti-war movement had been formed.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations.
The anti-war movement was the flashpoint in a much bigger social change, a revolution in ideals and social norms. The extreme conservatism of the McCarthy era, Jim Crow laws, and the John Birch Society had blanketed the country with fear in the 1950s. Fueled by the success of black freedom fighters, the discontent with the Vietnam War, and the security of the new birth control pills, young people lashed out against existing social norms, claiming protest music as their voice.
Heroes enough to kill, but not for voting. It don't believe in war, but once that gun gets sold.
This era of protest gave birth to a different kind of music. Music that challenged the status quo, called for change, and gave voice to the spirit of the revolution. More specifically, protest music called for reforms in government policies, free speech, and the granting of civil rights to African Americans and women. The protest music fed the anti-war and civil rights protests, and the protesters in turn adopted and spread the protest music.
The function of music within a revolution, I think, is twofold. One is to offer a sort of an alternative way in which people can express their views. And then it's also functions in sort of gatherings and rallies, for example, as a way that people can come together around a particular message, and a message that's more easily repeated.
It is only natural that leaders of the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests turned to protest music to express their emotions and demands. Recording artists from Bob Dylan to John Lennon and the Beatles sang about peace, and they attempted to reach many different audiences. The song "The Universal Soldier" by Buffy Sainte-Marie, made famous by Donovan, called soldiers to disregard orders in order to put an end to the war.
He's the universal soldier and he really is to blame. His orders come from far away no more. They come from here and there and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put the end to war.
Other songs were aimed at the government, questioning if the reasons for the war were justified. An array of motions was present in the protest music, but all the while, the music expressed a longing for peace. Protest songs and chants became the anthem wherever people marched against the war or rebelled against the status quo. Most of these protests for peace in Vietnam took place at universities and colleges all across the country, with students expressing a desire for both civil rights and peace.
We got the kids on our side and we can't lose. We just can't lose.
What started out as a local protest broke out of its shell and became a radical peace movement on college campuses and exploded into violent demonstrations at Berkeley, Columbia, and Kent State. These protests temporarily united liberals and moderates into a common cause that used the new tactics of nonviolence learned in the civil rights movement. These protests utilized music and chants that unified students under a common cause, with slogans such as "Hell no, we won't go," and "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" When police responded with excessive force against protesters, they succeeded in fueling even greater protest. Those who protested, and those who observed the protests on their screens at home, developed a level of rage that found its expression in protest music performances.
It's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam.
The protests of the 60s, fueled by protest music, brought about many short-term and long-term reforms. In the short term, the anti-war protests caused pressure to wind down the war by making support for the war uncomfortable, even for the elders who had no tolerance for the youth movement. The protest marches and music that mobilized millions led to several major legislative changes, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, granting civil rights to African Americans. The music created during this time dramatically reformed the music world, from the conservative music of the 1950s to the liberal, revolutionary music of the 60s. The world of politics was also reformed by short and long-term changes. In the short term, Nixon won the presidency election as a backlash candidate, but later lost the respect of the populace. In the long term, large-scale protests, protest music, and nonviolent resistance describe the pattern being used today in Occupy Wall Street protests. These are the next iteration of the hippie protests and counterculture revolutionary action of the 60s. Finally, protest music underscores, supports, and reflects cultural change. In this, the second decade of the 21st century, we may be on the verge of developing a new music to underscore the global clashes between liberationist action and conservative backlash.
You want a revolution, well, you know